My name is Cassidy. I am 33 years old, and I am the CEO of a corporate debt acquisition firm. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a toxic family member who thought you were weak. The trap was set 48 hours before the wedding at the rehearsal dinner. We were seated in the grand dining room of a sprawling Newport mansion. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over 50 of my brother's closest friends. Waiters in white coats circulated with trays of expensive caviar and imported champagne, making sure every single guest felt like royalty. I was quietly eating my salad at a table near the back when my mother Brenda marched up to me. She did not say hello or ask how my flight from New York was. She just slammed a thick leather-bound folder onto my lap, causing my heavy silver fork to clatter against my plate. Inside was a catering bill for $80,000. I looked up at her perfectly powdered face. She leaned in close so the wealthy guests at the next table could not hear her venom. "You need to put this on your black card right now," she whispered sharply. "Derek's investment accounts are temporarily frozen due to a massive portfolio transfer. He cannot access his liquid assets until Monday." I slowly wiped my mouth with a linen napkin and handed the folder back to her. "No," I said, my voice calm but firm. Her eyes went wide. She was not used to me saying no in public. "What do you mean no?" she hissed, leaning closer. "It is a temporary hold, Cassidy. You are his sister. You run a hedge fund. You have the money. Do not embarrass us." I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, refusing to break eye contact. "I do have the money, Brenda," I replied, "but I am not spending it on his lobster thermidor. I paid for his Porsche when he was 22 because you forced me to take out maximum student loans to cover it. I spent 5 years paying off that debt while he crashed the car twice. I am 33 now. I do not fund his fake billionaire lifestyle anymore." My mother turned pale and gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. Before she could unleash another threat, heavy footsteps approached from behind. It was my brother Derek. He looked flawless in his custom-tailored tuxedo, but his face was twisted in ugly anger. He had been watching us from the head table. "What is the problem here?" Derek demanded, glaring down at me. "Mom says you are making a scene over a simple cash flow issue. Are you seriously going to ruin my rehearsal dinner because you are too cheap to help your own flesh and blood?" Before I could answer, a soft, elegant voice broke the tension. "Derek, is everything okay?" I looked up and saw Simone, his beautiful bride-to-be. She was dressed in a stunning white silk gown. Simone came from a highly respected, wealthy family in Atlanta. She was intelligent and carried herself with undeniable grace. But as she looked at me, her warm eyes held a flicker of confusion and disappointment. Derek immediately softened his face, playing the absolute victim. He reached out and pulled Simone close, kissing her temple. "It is nothing, babe." Derek sighed, shaking his head tragically. "My sister is just refusing to cover the caterer because my hedge fund merger locked up my accounts this week. I guess she is still holding on to childhood grudges." Simone looked down at the $80,000 bill and then at me. Her brow furrowed. "Cassidy," she said softly, her tone full of genuine pity. "In my family, we always support each other. You run a massive financial firm. Are you really going to humiliate your own brother over a temporary bank hold on the happiest weekend of his life?" I looked at Simone, seeing how thoroughly my brother had brainwashed this brilliant woman. She honestly believed he was a titan of industry experiencing a minor banking glitch. I did not raise my voice or defend my character. I just reached into my designer purse and pulled out my heavy metal credit card. "Fine," I said, dropping the black card directly onto the $80,000 invoice. "Pay the caterer. Consider it my final contribution to this family." Derek flashed a smug, victorious grin at our mother. He had won again. He had publicly shamed the scapegoat into paying his way. But as the waiter approached to take the folder, I saw something they missed. Derek's phone, which he had left sitting face up on my table, illuminated with an urgent email notification. The bright screen displayed a message from a major federal bank. It read, "Urgent notice of asset liquidation." Derek had no idea his entire financial existence was about to be completely destroyed. Derek's fake empire was already burning to the ground, and I was the one holding the match. The notification vanished from the screen before Derek even noticed it. He was too busy soaking up the sympathetic gaze of his bride. Simone gently placed her hand over his, rubbing his knuckles soothingly. She looked at me across the table with an expression of polite disapproval. I could see the exact narrative playing out in her mind. Derek had painted himself as the golden boy who built an empire from scratch while carrying the burden of a jealous sister. Cassidy, I know family dynamics can be complicated, Simone said softly. Her voice was steady and measured, exactly what you would expect from someone raised in a high society Atlanta household. Derek has been nothing but generous to everyone in this room. He paid for my parents' flights and booked this venue. I understand you might feel overshadowed, but bringing up old loans at our rehearsal dinner is unnecessary. I sat perfectly still, letting her words hang in the air. The irony was suffocating. I was a self-made millionaire who dismantled failing corporations for a living, while the man sitting next to her was secretly drowning in toxic debt. But I did not defend myself. Anything I said right now would just make me look like the bitter sibling Derek claimed I was. Derek let out a heavy sigh and squeezed Simone's hand. "Leave it alone, Simone," he said, his voice dripping with fake exhaustion. Cassidy has always resented my success. Ever since I launched my first startup, she has been keeping score. It is exhausting, but I have learned to live with it. You cannot force someone to celebrate you when they are drowning in insecurities. My mother Brenda chimed in, leaning across the table to pat Derek's arm. "Do not let her ruin your night, sweetie. Your sister has always had a cold heart. We invited her here out of obligation because we are a forgiving family. The least she could do is pretend to be happy instead of radiating negativity." I looked at the three of them. A delusional mother, a con artist brother, and a bride who had no idea she was marrying into bankruptcy. "Keeping score, Derek?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. That is an interesting way to phrase it. Before Derek could respond, the waiter returned with a small silver tray holding the $80,000 receipt. He placed it in front of me. I picked up the heavy gold pen and signed my name with slow, deliberate strokes. I did not leave a tip on the card because I had already handed the waiter cash earlier. As I pushed the tray away, my father Richard strolled over from the bar. He was holding a glass of expensive scotch, swirling the amber liquid. "I see the financial crisis has been averted," he boomed, clapping Derek on the shoulder. "Good of you to finally pitch in, Cassidy. I was beginning to think you forgot what the word family means. I expect a much better attitude from you at the ceremony tomorrow." I stood up, smoothing my tailored dress. I picked up my clutch and looked directly into my father's eyes. "My attitude tomorrow will be exactly what this family deserves, Richard," I replied. I turned to walk away, but paused right behind Derek's chair. Just then, his phone illuminated for a second time. The screen was glaringly bright against the dim lighting. Simone glanced down at it, her brow furrowing. "Derek, your phone keeps buzzing," she noted, a hint of real concern creeping into her voice. "Is everything okay with the fund? The notification says urgent." Derek snapped his head down and snatched the phone off the table fast. His face paled for a fraction of a second before he forced an artificial smile. "Just a minor compliance issue, babe," he lied smoothly, slipping the phone into his tuxedo jacket. "Nothing my legal team cannot handle by Monday morning. You know how these algorithms overreact to large transfers." I leaned down slightly so my voice was right next to his ear. "You should probably check that minor compliance issue, Derek," I whispered coldly. "The market can be unpredictable. One minute you are a billionaire, and the next you are liquidating everything just to stay out of federal prison." Derek's head whipped around, his eyes flashing with genuine panic. "What did you just say to me?" he demanded. "Go back to your hotel room, Cassidy," my mother hissed. "We will see you tomorrow. Try not to ruin the wedding, too." I gave them one last smile, walked out of the dining room, and stepped into the Rhode Island night air. They thought the worst was over. They had absolutely no idea that the real nightmare had not even begun. I arrived at the Newport estate early to observe the final hours of my brother's illusion. The bridal suite was filled with the scent of hairspray and fresh roses. Simone sat in the main room while a makeup artist worked on her complexion. She looked genuinely radiant, completely unaware of the financial disaster she was about to marry. I retreated into the anteroom and poured a cup of black coffee. I wanted peace, but my parents had other plans. The heavy door clicked shut behind me. I turned around to see Brenda and Richard entering. Their faces were devoid of the fake joy they projected outside. Richard quickly turned the lock on the door, trapping us inside. Brenda marched straight toward me, her heels clicking sharply. She did not say good morning. She slapped a thick manila folder onto the vanity table next to my coffee. "Sign it," she demanded in an urgent hiss. I glanced at the folder and then at my father, acting like a cheap bouncer. "What is this?" I asked, taking a deliberate sip of my coffee. "It is a standard equity transfer," Richard grunted, stepping forward. "You are signing over your 30% stake in the family real estate firm to Derek. It is his wedding gift from you. It shows family solidarity. It proves you are committed to us, and not just your own selfish ambitions." I opened the folder. The legal jargon was dense, but my eyes caught the critical clauses. It was an unconditional transfer of my founding shares. These were the shares I earned by working 80-hour weeks in my 20s to get their failing properties off the ground. "You want me to give Derek the equity I built from scratch?" I asked, keeping my tone level. "So he can use it to impress Simone's family." Brenda leaned in, her eyes narrowing. "Simone comes from a prominent family, Cassidy. Her father is a retired federal judge in Atlanta. They expect Derek's portfolio to match their social standing. Your 30% will push his net worth into the bracket they expect. It is the least you can do after humiliating us last night." I looked past my mother toward the open door. I could hear Simone's soft laughter over the hum of a blow-dryer. She had no idea her future in-laws were actively extorting their own daughter to keep up a massive lie. I closed the folder and pushed it back across the marble vanity. "I am not signing anything," I said simply. "My shares belong to me. If Derek wants to impress a federal judge, he should try getting a real job instead of playing pretend with my hard-earned assets." Richard's face flushed a deep, angry red. He stepped forward, pointing a heavy finger at my face. "You ungrateful brat!" He snarled, his voice vibrating with rage. "We gave you everything. We fed you and clothed you. This is how you repay us. You will sign that paper right now. Or so help me, I will make sure every person in our social circle knows exactly how ruthless you are. You will be ruined." I looked at my furious father and my desperate mother. For a split second, I felt a flicker of the old childhood fear they used to control me with. But then I remembered the federal notification I saw flashing on Derek's phone. I threw my head back and let out a genuine sharp laugh. It echoed loudly in the small room, completely shattering their intimidation tactic. "What is so funny?" Brenda snapped, her hands curling into tight fists. "You think our family legacy is a joke." I stopped laughing and leaned closer to my mother, my expression turning ice cold. "I am laughing because you two are completely delusional," I whispered sharply. "You want me to sign over my shares to inflate Derek's net worth. But you clearly have not looked at the company ledgers in months. The family business is not an asset, Brenda. It is drowning in $5 million of toxic commercial debt." Richard froze, his arm dropping awkwardly to his side. Brenda's jaw went completely slack. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, her confidence vanishing. "The firm is profitable. Derek manages the accounts himself." "Derek has been using the company as collateral to fund his luxury lifestyle," I replied, my voice slicing through the room like a blade. "Giving him my shares would not make him richer. It would just make me legally liable for the $5 million he owes the bank. So no, Richard. I am not signing your little contract. But you should probably ask your golden boy why his accounts are really frozen." The silence that followed my words was heavy and suffocating. I could hear the faint hum of a blow-dryer from the next room, where Simone was blissfully preparing for the happiest day of her life. Inside our small locked anteroom, the atmosphere was venomous. Brenda stared at me, her chest heaving as her mind struggled to process the reality of Derek's financial ruin. But instead of questioning her precious golden child, she chose the path she always took. She chose violence against the scapegoat. Her hand moved faster than I anticipated. The sharp crack of her palm striking my left cheek echoed off the marble walls. The force of the slap snapped my head to the side, and a hot, stinging pain immediately bloomed across my skin. My coffee cup rattled slightly on the vanity table. For a moment, nobody moved. Richard stood there breathing heavily, his fists clenched at his sides, as if he was ready to back up his wife's physical assault. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I slowly turned my head back to face my mother. I raised my hand and gently touched my burning cheek, feeling the heat radiating from the red mark she had just left. "You ungrateful, vicious liar!" Brenda hissed, her voice trembling with unhinged rage. "How dare you make up such disgusting lies about your brother on his wedding day? Derek is brilliant. He is a success. You are just trying to poison his marriage before it even begins, because you are bitter and alone." Richard stepped closer, towering over me in his expensive tuxedo. "Listen to me very carefully, Cassidy," he growled, pointing a finger inches from my face. "I do not care what imaginary numbers you think you saw. You are going to pick up that pen, and you are going to sign over those shares right now. If you do not, I swear to you this family is done with you. We will walk out there tonight in front of 500 of the most influential people in Newport and Atlanta, and we will publicly disown you. You will be cut out of the family trust. You will lose our name, our connections, and our protection. You will be nothing to us." I looked at my father, watching the vein bulge in his neck. He really thought he held the ultimate trump card. For 33 years, the threat of being kicked out of the family was the weapon they used to keep me in line. They used it to make me pay for Derek's car. They used it to make me work for free in their failing business. They thought my biggest fear was being abandoned by them. They did not realize that I had outgrown them a long time ago. I looked down at the contract on the table. A transfer of equity meant I would be legally tied to the $5 million of debt they were trying to hide, but a formal disownment. That was a completely different legal mechanism. If they formally severed ties and removed me from the family trust, it would officially dissolve my liability as a founding partner in their corrupt enterprise. I lowered my hand from my cheek and smiled. It was a cold, calculated smile that made Richard take a half step back. "You want to disown me?" I asked, my voice eerily calm against their screaming. "You want to cut me out of the family trust and strip me of the family name?" "Yes," Brenda spat, crossing her arms defensively. "We will erase you, Cassidy. You will leave this estate today with absolutely nothing. No family and no future." I picked up my purse and slung it over my shoulder. "Then do it," I challenged, staring directly into my mother's eyes. "If you want to disown me, do not just threaten me behind closed doors. Do it in writing. I want a formal notarized letter of disownment signed by both of you and Derek. And I want it tonight. At the reception. In front of all 500 of those influential guests you care so much about." Richard narrowed his eyes, looking at me as if I had lost my mind. "You are bluffing," he scoffed. "You do not have the guts to face that kind of public humiliation." "Try me," I replied, stepping toward the open doorway. "Present the letter at dinner. If you give me that document tonight, I will gladly walk away from this family forever. But until then, I am not signing a single thing." Brenda let out a cruel, condescending laugh. She reached out and gripped the doorframe, her eyes flashing with triumphant malice. "You asked for it, Cassidy," she sneered. "I will have the estate lawyer draft it this afternoon. Tonight, everyone will know exactly what a toxic disappointment you are. Enjoy the ceremony because it will be your last family event." I walked past her, stepping back into the bright hallway. I could hear Simone laughing happily in the next room. Brenda thought she had just won the ultimate victory. She was completely unaware that she had just eagerly agreed to walk straight into my master legal trap. The grand lawn of this Newport estate had been transformed into a breathtaking venue. 500 white wooden chairs were perfectly aligned, facing the sparkling ocean. Massive arches of imported white roses and orchids framed the altar where my brother would soon stand. A string quartet played softly in the background, filling the salty air with elegant music. Wealthy guests, draped in designer silk and expensive diamonds, chattered excitedly as they took their assigned places in the front rows. I walked past the politicians, the local celebrities, and the wealthy socialites my parents had invited to show off their fake status. I followed the usher all the way to the very back of the seating arrangement. My assigned seat was placed in the last possible row, intentionally positioned right next to the swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen. Every time a server rushed past, the loud clatter of industrial silverware and shouting chefs completely drowned out the string quartet. It was a final petty insult from Brenda and Richard. They wanted to make sure I knew exactly where I stood in their hierarchy. I sat down, smoothing my dress, completely unbothered by their childish games. A few minutes later, a tall, dignified African-American man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit walked over and sat in the empty chair right next to me. He let out a slow, steady breath and checked his expensive silver watch. He carried an air of absolute authority, but his eyes were warm and kind. I recognized him immediately from the engagement photos. It was Judge Carter Simone's father. "It is quite a crowd today," he said, offering a polite smile. I needed to step away from the front and catch my breath before the procession begins. "Giving away your only daughter is heavier work than I anticipated." I smiled back, extending my hand. "It is completely understandable," I replied. "I am Cassidy, Derek's sister." The judge's face lit up with genuine delight, and he shook my hand firmly. "Cassidy," he exclaimed softly, "it is a pleasure to finally meet you. Derek has told us so much about your financial firm. Simone was just saying how impressed she is with your career. We are very proud to have Derek joining our family. He is a remarkably driven young man." I kept my expression perfectly neutral. "He is certainly driven," I agreed carefully. Judge Carter leaned back, looking out over the sea of guests with a proud, fatherly glow. "I have spent 30 years on the federal bench looking at the worst sides of humanity," he said, his voice lowering into a conversational tone. "It makes you protective. I admit I had my investigators look into your brother when he first proposed to Simone. But his portfolio is flawless. The family real estate business he runs is incredibly solid. In fact, I was so impressed by his vision for the upcoming commercial expansion that I decided to help him secure his next big step." My heart skipped a beat, but I kept my face entirely calm. "A commercial expansion?" I asked, keeping my tone light and conversational. I did not realize he was expanding so soon. "Oh, yes." Judge Carter nodded proudly. "He is acquiring 3 new luxury properties in Manhattan. The capital requirements were steep, so I used my connections at the bank to personally co-sign a $10 million bridge loan for him. The funds transferred directly into his corporate account yesterday afternoon. I consider it an investment in my daughter's future." A cold chill washed over my entire body. The noise from the catering kitchen seemed to fade away completely as my brain processed the sheer magnitude of what the judge had just confessed. Derek did not have a commercial expansion planned. Derek was drowning in $5 million of toxic debt, and his accounts were frozen by federal regulators. If Judge Carter co-signed a $10 million loan, and those funds went directly into Derek's corporate accounts, Derek was not just a failing businessman anymore. He was actively committing massive federal wire fraud. He had forged documents, lied about his assets, and used his bride's wealthy father to secure millions under false pretenses. The string quartet suddenly stopped playing. A new triumphant song began, signaling the start of the ceremony. Judge Carter stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a proud smile. "That is my cue," he said warmly. "It was wonderful meeting you, Cassidy." I watched this brilliant, honorable man walk toward the front of the aisle to hand his daughter over to a desperate criminal. The second he was out of sight, I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. The trap was no longer just about family drama. It was now a federal crime scene. The ceremony progressed with a sickeningly sweet perfection. The ocean breeze gently ruffled Simone's veil as the officiant spoke about honesty and building a foundation of trust. Derek stood there looking like the perfect gentleman, holding her hands and staring deeply into her eyes. It was a flawless performance. If I did not know the truth, I would have believed it myself. But my phone was burning a hole in my hand. I slipped it out of my purse, resting it discreetly on my lap. I opened my encrypted messaging app and immediately pulled up my direct line to my lead paralegal in New York. New. Are you online? I typed. Yes, boss, came the immediate reply. What is the status of the Newport wedding? The groom just scammed his new father-in-law out of a $10 million bridge loan. I need you to pull up the acquisition files from 3 months ago, specifically the Vanguard portfolio. A few seconds passed. I watched Derek gently wipe a fake tear from his eye as Simone read her vows. It was disgusting. My phone buzzed silently. I have the Vanguard files, boss. We acquired $20 million of defaulted commercial debt, previously held by several private lenders. The primary debtor is listed as your family real estate firm. The loans are severely delinquent and fully collateralized by all corporate assets. Good. I typed back quickly. Are there any restrictions on when we can call in the debt? None. When we bought the paper, we acquired all rights to demand immediate payment in full. The previous lenders were desperate to offload it for pennies on the dollar because your brother had been dodging their calls for 6 months. We own him completely. What do you want to do? I looked up from my screen. The officiant was now asking Derek to repeat his vows. I promise to protect you, Derek said, his voice projecting confidently across the manicured lawn. I promise to build a life with you that is secure and honest. I looked down and began typing furiously. He is using the family firm to secure millions in fraudulent new loans to cover his tracks. My parents are fully aware and tried to force me into signing over my equity this morning to make me a financial meat shield. They are going to formally disown me at the reception tonight to try and cut me off before I can expose them. My paralegal's response came back instantly. That is insane. If they formally disown you and you accept it in writing, it completely severs your legal ties to their financial liabilities. They are handing you the perfect exit strategy. Exactly, I replied. I want you to prepare the foreclosure notices for every single property held by the family firm. Draft the asset seizure orders for Derek's personal accounts as well. Done. When do you want me to file the paperwork with the federal court? We can have marshals at their corporate office by Monday morning. No. I typed, a cold smile playing on my lips. I want it done today. I want the electronic filings submitted within the hour. But it is Saturday, boss. The courts are closed. The electronic federal registry is automated, I reminded him. If we file the default notices now, they will generate immediate automated alerts to all connected financial institutions. Derek's remaining credit lines will freeze instantly. I watched as Derek slipped the massive diamond ring onto Simone's finger. It was a ring paid for with stolen money. It was a ring paid for with my money. Understood, my paralegal replied. I am queuing up the filings now. Just give me the word. The officiant smiled broadly at the crowd. I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride. The guests erupted into applause. My parents stood up in the front row, clapping enthusiastically, their faces beaming with pride. They thought they had secured their future. They thought they had successfully sold a lie to a federal judge and trapped a wealthy heiress in their web of debt. Derek leaned in and kissed Simone deeply, the picture of a triumphant king. I looked at my screen one last time. I watched the happy couple turn to face the cheering crowd. Initiate the foreclosure protocol on his primary assets. I texted, my thumb hitting send with a satisfying tap. Time the final bank freeze for the cake cutting. Let us give them a reception they will never forget. The transition from the lawn to the grand ballroom of the estate was seamless. We were ushered into a massive glass conservatory, draped in white silk and dripping with crystal chandeliers. Waiters in pristine uniforms stood at attention, carrying silver trays loaded with glasses of vintage Dom Perignon. In the center of the room, a massive 10-tier wedding cake stood next to an elaborate ice sculpture of 2 swans. The live 12-piece band started playing a lively jazz number as the massive wooden doors swung open. Derek and Simone made their grand entrance to thunderous applause. 500 guests stood up cheering for the newly minted power couple. Derek walked with his chest puffed out, waving to the crowd like a conquering king returning from a victorious battle. He spun Simone around on the dance floor, dipping her low for the cameras. He was soaking up every single second of the attention, completely oblivious to the financial guillotine suspended directly over his neck. I took my assigned seat at the back table. My chair was positioned so close to the catering entrance, I could feel the rush of cold air every time a waiter pushed through the swinging doors. Brenda and Richard were seated at the front VIP table, clinking glasses with Judge Carter and his wealthy relatives. They looked incredibly smug. They thought they had successfully secured their retirement by marrying off their golden child to Atlanta royalty. It took Derek less than 30 minutes to make his way to my table. He could not resist the urge to gloat. He approached with his arm wrapped tightly around Simone's waist, holding a glass of bourbon in his free hand. He looked down at me with a sickeningly sweet smile, designed entirely for his bride's benefit. "Cassidy, I am so glad you stayed," Derek said, his voice dripping with fake affection. "I know you usually hate these large family gatherings, but it means the world to us that you are here to witness this." Simone smiled warmly at me. "It really is a beautiful reception," she added gracefully. "It is certainly an expensive one," I replied, taking a slow sip of my water. "I am just surprised you had the time to plan all of this, Derek, especially with that massive commercial expansion you are running. Judge Carter mentioned his generous $10 million investment. You must be incredibly busy managing that kind of new capital." Derek's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second. His grip on Simone's waist tightened slightly. "Yes, well, you know how it is in real estate," he chuckled nervously. "We are moving fast. Securing prime Manhattan properties requires aggressive capital. My father-in-law just understands the vision." I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table. "That is fascinating," I said, my tone perfectly conversational, but laced with venom. "I assume you already updated your SEC filings to reflect the new debt obligations. Taking on $10 million in bridge loans requires immediate disclosure, especially if you are using your existing commercial properties as collateral." Derek's face lost a shade of color. A bead of sweat formed near his hairline. He shifted his weight uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward the kitchen doors as if looking for an escape route. "It is all being handled by my legal team, Cassidy," he shot back, his voice losing its friendly warmth. "We do not need to talk about shop on my wedding day." I did not let him off the hook. I kept my eyes locked on his, watching the panic rise in his chest. "I only bring it up because federal regulators are notoriously strict right now," I continued smoothly. "With a bridge loan of that magnitude, they will scrutinize your debt-to-equity ratio immediately. If your previous loans are in default, or if your accounts are frozen, a new $10 million wire transfer would trigger an automatic federal audit. You could be looking at wire fraud charges before the honeymoon is even over. It is just standard compliance, Derek. I am sure you have it all under control." The color completely drained from Derek's face. He swallowed hard, the Adam's apple in his throat bobbing visibly. Simone stopped smiling. She turned her head and looked directly at Derek. She was not just a beautiful bride, she was an educated, intelligent woman. She caught the sudden tension radiating from her new husband. "Federal audit?" Simone asked, her voice dropping slightly. "Derek, what is she talking about? Why would your accounts be frozen?" Derek let out a loud, forced laugh that sounded completely unnatural. He quickly pulled Simone against his side, physically turning her away from my table. "She is just joking, babe," he stammered, his voice pitching higher than normal. "You know Cassidy. She always has to play the cynical hedge fund manager. Come on, we need to go say hello to the senator at table 4. He practically dragged her away, his polished black shoes sliding quickly across the marble floor. Simone followed him, but she did not smile. She pulled her shoulders back, resisting his grip just a fraction. Before they disappeared into the crowded dance floor, Simone turned her head and looked back at me over her shoulder. Her dark eyes were narrowed, her expression clouded with a deep, lingering suspicion. The seed of doubt was firmly planted. The dinner service began with a choreographed procession of waiters carrying silver trays. I sat quietly at my table near the kitchen doors, cutting into my steak and watching the high society guests mingle. The tension from my conversation with Derek hung in the air, but the reception moved forward exactly on schedule. After the main course was cleared, the live band stopped playing. The master of ceremonies stepped up to the microphone and announced that it was time for the toasts. My father gave a short, booming speech about legacy and wealth. Then it was Brenda's turn. My mother glided onto the stage at the front of the ballroom, looking every bit the wealthy Newport matriarch in her silver evening gown. She took the microphone and beamed down at Derek and Simone, who were seated at the sweetheart table directly in front of her. When I look at my son today, my heart simply overflows. Brenda began, her voice echoing through the massive glass conservatory. Derek, you have always been the light of this family. You are ambitious, kind, and relentlessly generous. You built a real estate empire from the ground up, but you never lost your gentle spirit. And Simone, we are so incredibly blessed to welcome you into our lives. You are the perfect match for our golden boy. To the Carter family, thank you for trusting us with your beautiful daughter. We are two great families uniting tonight. The crowd erupted into polite applause. Judge Carter raised his glass in a dignified salute. Simone smiled, though it looked a little tighter than it had an hour ago. But then Brenda let out a long, trembling sigh. She lowered the microphone slightly and looked down at the floor, acting as if she were overcome with a heavy, heartbreaking emotion. The ballroom went quiet, waiting for her to continue. A mother always wants to believe that her family is perfect, Brenda said, her tone shifting from joyous to deeply sorrowful. We want to believe that love can fix any broken bond. But sometimes a mother has to make the hardest choice of all, to protect the children who are actually building a future. She slowly raised her head and pointed her manicured finger directly at the back of the room. She pointed straight at me. 500 heads turned simultaneously, following her gaze to my isolated table near the kitchen doors. For 33 years, my daughter Cassidy has been a dark cloud of selfishness and jealousy over this family, Brenda declared, her voice shaking with fake tears. We have given her everything. We paid for her education. We supported her career. We tried to include her in the family business. But no matter how much love we poured into her, she only returned it with bitterness. Loud gasps rippled through the crowd. People began whispering behind their hands. I put my fork down and wiped my mouth with my napkin, staring back at her with absolute calm. Even today, on the happiest day of her brother's life, she has done nothing but try to sabotage him. Brenda continued, her voice growing louder and more venomous. She refused to help with the wedding expenses. She spread vicious lies to our new in-laws. She sits in the back of this beautiful room, radiating hatred because she cannot stand to see her brother succeed where she has failed. She is empty inside, and I will not allow her toxicity to poison this beautiful new marriage. I glanced over at the sweetheart table. Derek was leaning back in his chair, holding a glass of champagne with a smug, satisfied smirk on his face. He thought this was his ultimate victory. But Simone looked absolutely horrified. She was staring at her mother-in-law with wide eyes, completely appalled by the grotesque public shaming taking place. In her world, family matters were handled with dignity and grace behind closed doors. Watching Brenda humiliate her own daughter in front of 500 guests was destroying the polished illusion my parents had worked so hard to build. I have spent my entire life trying to fix her, Brenda cried dramatically, wiping a non-existent tear from her cheek. But I cannot do it anymore. I have to protect my son. I have to protect my family. The ballroom was dead silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. Brenda handed the microphone to the master of ceremonies. She reached over to the podium and picked up a rolled piece of thick parchment paper tied with a black ribbon. Without another word, she stepped off the stage. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as she marched down the center aisle of the ballroom. Her eyes were locked on me, filled with a cold, ruthless triumph. She was walking directly toward my table, holding the legal weapon she thought would destroy me completely, unaware she was playing right into my hands. Brenda reached my small table by the kitchen doors. Her breathing was heavy with theatrical exertion, but her eyes were cold and sharp. She raised the thick parchment paper above her head for a brief second, ensuring every single guest in the room was watching her. Then she brought her arm down and slammed the document flat against the center of my table. The heavy black ribbon unspooled across the white tablecloth, knocking over my crystal water glass. "Read it!" Brenda commanded, her voice projecting loud enough for the first few rows of VIP tables to hear perfectly. "It is a formal notarized declaration. Effective immediately, you are no longer recognized as a member of this family. You are stripped of our name, and you are completely removed from the family trust. Derek is now legally declared the sole heir and the sole operator of the entire family empire. You get nothing, Cassidy. Not a single cent. Not a single share of the business. You are entirely severed from our legacy." A collective gasp echoed through the massive conservatory. The high society guests who had just been dining on expensive steak were now staring in absolute shock. Whispers erupted across the ballroom like a sudden gust of wind. I looked past Brenda and saw Richard striding down the aisle to stand directly behind his wife. Derek was right beside him, leaving Simone entirely alone at the sweetheart table. Derek's face was glowing with arrogant satisfaction. He crossed his arms over his custom tuxedo, looking down at me as if I were a pest that had finally been exterminated. "You heard your mother!" Richard barked, his voice tight with aggression. "The document is signed and legally binding. You have been formally disowned. Now I want you to stand up, take your purse, and walk out of those kitchen doors. Leave this property immediately before I have the security team physically drag you out into the street." Derek chuckled, shaking his head. "Do not make this harder than it has to be, Cassidy." Derek added, his tone dripping with fake pity. "You played your little games and you lost. Just walk away and let the real family celebrate in peace." I shifted my gaze back to the front of the room. Simone had stood up from her chair. Her beautiful face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the edge of the sweetheart table. She looked at her new husband and her new in-laws with absolute disgust. Beside her, Judge Carter had placed his napkin on his plate, his jaw locked in silent fury. In their world of prestigious Atlanta law and honorable conduct, public humiliation of a family member was considered the ultimate taboo. Simone was witnessing the true vicious nature of the people she had just legally tied herself to. She took a half step forward as if she wanted to intervene, but she remained frozen in shock. Brenda and Richard were waiting for the breakdown. They were waiting for me to burst into tears, beg for their forgiveness, or scream in humiliation. They wanted a dramatic exit to validate their cruel narrative in front of their wealthy peers. But I did not give them a single tear. I did not even frown. Instead, I reached out and picked up the heavy parchment paper. The edges were crisp, and the paper smelled faintly of fresh ink and sealing wax. I slowly unfolded it, flattening it out on the table next to my dinner plate. I read the legal text carefully. It was perfectly drafted by their expensive estate lawyers. It explicitly stated that I was removed from all family trusts, all corporate liabilities, and all shared assets. I traced my finger down to the bottom of the page. There they were. 3 fresh signatures in dark blue ink: Brenda, Richard, and Derek. Right below their names was the official embossed stamp of a licensed Rhode Island notary public. They had actually done it. They had legally severed me from their financial sinking ship. I looked up from the paper. Brenda was glaring at me, her hands planted firmly on her hips, tapping her foot against the marble floor. "Well," Brenda snapped impatiently, "are you going to leave or do I need to call the guards?" I carefully folded the document and slid it into my designer purse, keeping it perfectly safe. Then I slowly stood up from my chair and smoothed the front of my dress. I looked at Brenda, then at Richard, and finally at Derek. I let out a soft, genuine laugh. I did not look destroyed. I looked incredibly relieved. I smiled warmly at the 3 of them. "Thank you," I said, my voice ringing with crystal-clear confidence. "This is exactly what I needed." The silence in the room shifted from shock to absolute confusion. Brenda stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, unable to comprehend why her ultimate punishment had just been received with a warm smile. Richard aggressively crossed his arms, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. They expected me to run out of the kitchen doors crying. But I did not move toward the exit. Instead, I calmly reached into my black designer tote bag, resting on the chair beside me. My hand brushed past my wallet and my keys until my fingers wrapped around a thick, heavy manila envelope. I pulled it out and set it on the table right next to my discarded dinner plate. The envelope was entirely unmarked, except for a massive seal of dark red wax pressed firmly into the center flap. The deep crimson color stood out violently against the pristine white tablecloth. The master of ceremonies lowered his microphone. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, waiting to see what I was going to do next. I picked up the heavy envelope and stepped out from behind my table. I did not look at Brenda or Richard as I walked forward. I completely ignored my father's angry demands for the security team to remove me. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floor, echoing through the dead-quiet conservatory. I walked straight down the center aisle, passing the rows of wealthy guests, who were now leaning out of their seats to get a better look. "What are you doing?" Brenda hissed, stepping directly into my path, her silver evening gown shimmering under the chandeliers. "I told you to leave this property right now." I did not even break my stride. I simply stepped around her, keeping my eyes locked on the sweetheart table at the front of the room. Richard tried to grab my arm as I passed, but I swiftly pulled out of his reach. "Do not touch me, Richard," I said, my voice low but carrying enough authority to make him freeze in his tracks. "You just legally declared that I am not your daughter. That means you have absolutely no right to tell me what to do." I closed the distance to the front of the room. Derek had finally dropped his arrogant smirk. He stood up from his chair, pushing it back so forcefully that it almost toppled over. He saw the thick envelope in my hands, and his eyes darted frantically around the room. He knew I was a hedge fund manager. He knew I bought corporate debt. The realization of what might be inside that envelope hit him like a freight train. His fake billionaire posture completely collapsed. "Cassidy, stop right there!" Derek demanded, his voice cracking slightly. He rushed around the front of the sweetheart table, moving to block my path to Simone. "Whatever game you are playing, it ends right now. Security, get her out of here." I stopped walking, standing just 3 feet away from my brother. I held the red wax envelope out, extending it past him directly toward his beautiful bride. "This is for you, Simone," I said, my voice perfectly steady. "Consider it a late wedding gift. It contains everything you need to know about the man you just married." Derek lunged forward, his face twisting into a mask of pure panic. He reached out with both hands, aggressively trying to snatch the envelope from my grip. "Do not listen to her, Simone," he shouted desperately. "She is crazy! Give me that envelope right now!" Before Derek's fingers could even graze the thick paper, a massive hand clamped down firmly onto his shoulder. The grip was so powerful that Derek let out a sharp gasp and stumbled backward. It was Judge Carter. Simone's father had stepped off the elevated VIP platform with surprising speed for a man his age. He stood between Derek and me, his tall, imposing frame completely dwarfing my frantic brother. The judge did not yell. He did not lose his temper. He simply stared down at Derek with the cold, terrifying authority of a man who had spent 30 years sending criminals to federal prison. "Let my daughter read it," the judge commanded, his voice rumbling through the quiet ballroom like distant thunder. Derek swallowed hard, his chest heaving with panicked breaths. "But sir," he stammered, taking another step back. "She is lying. She is trying to ruin us." Judge Carter ignored him entirely. He turned his dignified gaze toward me and gave a short single nod of approval. I stepped forward and placed the heavy envelope directly into Simone's trembling hands. Simone looked down at the dark red wax. She looked at Derek, who was now sweating profusely, pulling nervously at the collar of his custom tuxedo. Then she looked at me, her dark eyes wide with apprehension. With a sharp crack, she broke the wax seal. She opened the flap and pulled out the thick stack of legal papers. The entire ballroom seemed to lean in closer. Simone stared at the very first page. Printed across the top in bold black letters was a federal court notice of default, and right below the official seal, it was stamped with today's date. Simone's eyes scanned the thick black text printed across the official federal letterhead. Her voice trembled slightly as she began to read the document aloud to the dead-silent ballroom. Notice of default and intent to seize assets. She read her voice echoing off the glass walls of the massive conservatory. The primary debtor is listed as Derek, and the total outstanding balance is $20 million. A collective gasp ripped through the crowd of 500 high society guests. The wealthy elite of Newport and Atlanta stared at the golden boy standing at the sweetheart table. Derek looked like he was going to be physically sick. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified little child caught in a massive lie. "He is not a billionaire," I said, stepping closer to the table so my voice carried across the entire room. "My brother has been running a massive financial illusion for years. He is $20 million in debt to private lenders. He has not made a single payment in 6 months. His personal accounts are completely empty, and his credit lines are fully frozen." Brenda let out a sharp cry and covered her mouth with both hands. Richard took a step toward me. His fists clenched, but Judge Carter shot him a look so lethal that my father froze instantly in his tracks. "He used the family real estate business as collateral to secure those massive loans," I continued, my voice steady and unyielding. "That is why my parents cornered me in the bridal suite this morning. They handed me a contract and tried to force me to sign over my 30% equity in the family firm. They told me it was a wedding gift to help Derek impress Simone's wealthy family. But it was a trap. They knew the company was drowning in toxic debt. They wanted me to sign away my shares so I would be legally liable for the fallout when the federal bank finally came knocking. They wanted me to be their financial meat shield." The ballroom erupted in horrified whispers. Guests began pulling out their phones. Simone dropped the first page and looked at the second document in the stack. Her eyes widened in absolute horror as she processed the numbers. "This is a wire transfer log," Simone said, her voice breaking. "It shows the $10 million bridge loan my father co-signed yesterday. The money did not go to a commercial expansion. It was immediately wired to an offshore holding account in the Cayman Islands to cover a delinquent margin call." Judge Carter turned slowly to look at his new son-in-law. His face was a mask of cold fury. "You used my name and my daughter's trust to commit federal wire fraud." He rumbled, his voice low and incredibly dangerous. Derek was shaking visibly. He looked frantically at the sea of disgusted faces surrounding him. He looked at his mother, who was now weeping hysterically into her hands. He looked at his father, who was staring at the floor, unable to meet anyone else's gaze. Finally, Derek looked at me. His fear instantly mutated into desperate, unhinged rage. "It is a lie," Derek screamed, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "She is a jealous, psychotic liar. She fabricated all of this because she hates me. That federal notice is fake. Those wire logs are fake. It is a complete forgery. She printed it in her office to ruin my wedding day. You have to believe me, Simone. It is a forgery." He was practically hyperventilating, his custom tuxedo now soaked with nervous sweat. He slammed his hand on the sweetheart table, rattling the expensive crystal champagne flutes. "Someone call the police," he yelled, desperately trying to regain control of the narrative. "Arrest her for forgery. Arrest her for trespassing. Get her out of my wedding right now." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply let him exhaust his frantic energy while the entire ballroom watched him unravel. When he finally stopped screaming, he stood there panting, waiting for anyone to take his side. Nobody moved to help him. The silence was absolute and completely deafening. I smiled warmly at my brother, feeling a deep, profound sense of peace washing over me. I slowly raised my hand and pointed past him toward the massive wooden doors at the far end of the ballroom. "If you really think this is a forgery, Derek," I said, my voice slicing cleanly through the heavy silence of the room, "then you should probably tell that directly to the authorities. Is the SEC investigator walking through that door a forgery too?" Every head in the ballroom snapped toward the grand wooden doors at the far end of the conservatory. Two men and one woman dressed in sharp, dark suits stepped into the room. They did not look like wedding guests. They moved with a rigid, purposeful authority, completely ignoring the beautiful floral arrangements and the bewildered stares of the high society crowd. One of the men held up a leather badge wallet flashing a silver shield. The music had stopped long ago, but now even the whispers died out. The silence was so absolute that the synchronized clicking of the agent's shoes on the marble floor sounded like gunshots. Derek gripped the edge of the sweetheart table, his knuckles turning completely white. His jaw dropped as he watched the agents marching straight down the center aisle. He looked like a man standing on the tracks watching a freight train barrel toward him. He spun around wildly, looking for someone to save him. He locked eyes with my father. "Dad, do something," Derek pleaded, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. "Tell them it is a mistake. Call our lawyers." Richard finally snapped out of his shock. His face turned a deep, violent shade of purple. Instead of looking at the federal agents, he turned his full wrath directly onto me. He marched across the dance floor, closing the distance between us until he was standing inches from my face. "You did this!" Richard roared, spittle flying from his lips. "You called them here to ruin your brother's life, you vindictive little brat." I stood my ground, not moving a single inch. "I did not have to call them Richard," I replied calmly. "When you default on $20 million of federal loans and then attempt to wire $10 million of fraudulent funds to the Cayman Islands, the banking algorithms notify the authorities automatically." All I did was stop protecting him. Richard let out a harsh, barking laugh. "You think you are so smart, Cassidy," he spat, jabbing a thick finger at my shoulder. "But you just destroyed yourself too. You are a founding partner of the family real estate firm. Your name is on the original incorporation papers. If Derek goes down for corporate fraud and the bank seizes the company assets, you are going down right alongside us. You are legally liable for a third of that debt. You just called the feds on your own bank account." Derek heard this, and a sick, desperate smile broke across his sweating face. "He is right, Cassidy," Derek yelled, pointing at me from behind the table. "We are a family business. If I am guilty of wire fraud, the board of directors is complicit. You are on the board. You are going to prison with me." I looked at my brother and my father, watching them desperately try to drag me into their sinking ship. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they had completely forgotten what happened less than 5 minutes ago. I reached into my designer purse and slowly pulled out the thick, folded parchment paper. The black ribbon dangled loosely from my fingers. I held the document up high so the federal agents who were now approaching the front of the room could clearly see it. "Actually, Richard," I said, my voice echoing cleanly through the massive room, "I am not on the board of directors anymore, and I am not a legal member of this family." Richard's aggressive posture faltered. He stared at the parchment paper in my hand, a look of dawning horror slowly creeping across his face. "This notarized document that you and Brenda just handed me in front of 500 witnesses formally severs my legal ties to the family trust," I explained, pronouncing every word with crystal clear precision. "You legally declared Derek the sole heir and the sole operator of the entire empire. You explicitly removed my name from all shared assets and all corporate liabilities. By officially disowning me and forcing me out of the company trust, you just legally absorbed 100% of the debt." Richard's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked back at Brenda, who was standing near the stage, trembling violently. "You thought you were punishing me?" I continued, stepping closer to my father. "You thought you were throwing me out into the cold. But what you actually did was sign a legally binding confession that Derek is solely responsible for the fraud. You handed me the perfect legal shield and you took the entire $20 million bullet yourselves." Brenda let out a high-pitched gasp. Her eyes rolled back into her head and her knees completely buckled. She collapsed onto the marble floor in a heap of shimmering silver fabric. Several guests screamed and rushed forward to help her, but Richard was completely paralyzed. He stared at me, realizing that his cruel attempt to humiliate his daughter had just cost him his entire fortune and his freedom. Derek realized it too. The agents were only 20 feet away now. Derek looked at Simone, who had backed away from him as if he were a monster. He looked at the federal agents. Then, without warning, Derek turned and bolted. He scrambled over the sweetheart table, knocking the ice sculpture to the floor, and sprinted desperately toward the catering doors. Derek did not make it more than 20 feet. He was fast, but his panic made him clumsy. As he lunged toward the swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen, a massive figure stepped out of the shadows and blocked his path completely. It was Judge Carter. For a retired man in his late 60s, the judge moved with terrifying speed and precision. He planted his feet firmly on the marble floor, crossing his arms over his broad chest. He looked like a solid brick wall wrapped in a tailored charcoal suit. Derek slammed the brakes, his designer shoes skidding across the polished floor. "Out of my way!" Derek screamed wildly, waving his hands. "Let me pass! I have to get out of here!" Judge Carter did not budge a single inch. He reached out and grabbed Derek by the lapels of his custom tuxedo, lifting him slightly off his toes. "You are not going anywhere, son," Judge Carter growled, his voice rumbling with absolute authority. "You are going to stand right here and face the consequences of your actions like a man." Derek struggled against the older man's iron grip, but it was useless. "Please," Derek begged, his arrogant facade completely shattered. "You have to let me go. I have the $10 million. I can fix this. I can pay off the private lenders and make everything right. Just let me get to my car." Judge Carter let out a short, humorless laugh. He leaned down so his face was inches from Derek's sweating forehead. "You really think you have my $10 million? The judge asked, his tone dripping with utter contempt. "I spent 30 years presiding over federal fraud cases, Derek. I know a con artist when I see one. I just wanted to believe the best for my daughter's sake." But the second Cassidy mentioned a commercial expansion to me before the ceremony, my instincts kicked in. "I am not a fool." Derek's eyes widened in horror as the judge's words washed over him. "What are you talking about?" Derek whispered. "I called my contacts at the Federal Reserve the moment the string quartet started playing." Judge Carter explained, his voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. "I had them run a backdoor emergency check on the routing numbers you provided for your corporate accounts. They flagged the offshore transfer immediately. The $10 million bridge loan never cleared the Cayman Islands. I froze the funds 30 minutes before you even said your vows. Your accounts are completely empty, Derek. You did not get a single dime of my family money." Derek's entire body went limp. The desperate hope that he could somehow buy his way out of this nightmare evaporated instantly. He had risked federal wire fraud charges to steal $10 million, and he had absolutely nothing to show for it. His golden empire was nothing but dust. I watched from my table, savoring the absolute destruction of his ego. Heavy footsteps approached from behind. Simone walked slowly across the dance floor, her beautiful white silk gown trailing behind her. She stopped right next to her father. She did not look at Derek with sadness or pity. She looked at him with absolute freezing disgust. "Simone." "Babe." Derek pleaded, his voice cracking as tears finally spilled down his cheeks. "Please, I did it for us. I wanted to give you the life you deserve. I was going to fix the business and make us billionaires." Simone did not say a single word in response to his pathetic lies. She raised her left hand and stared at the massive diamond engagement ring glittering under the crystal chandeliers. She had thought it was a symbol of love and devotion. Now she knew it was just another piece of stolen collateral secured by fraud. She reached over, grabbed the diamond, and slid the heavy platinum band off her finger. Derek watched her in sheer panic. "Simone, no," he begged, shaking his head rapidly. Simone walked over to the nearest guest table. A half-full glass of expensive champagne sat near the edge. She held the $100,000 ring over the glass and let it fall. It dropped into the golden liquid with a soft, hollow clink, sinking straight to the bottom. "We are getting an annulment tomorrow morning," Simone said, her voice as cold as ice. "Do not ever contact me or my family again." Before Derek could even process his bride's final words, the 3 plainclothes federal agents arrived. The lead agent grabbed Derek's shoulder and spun him around violently, pinning his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs echoed through the massive conservatory as they were locked tightly around Derek's wrists. Derek groaned in pain, his face pressed awkwardly against the shoulder of the federal agent. He was completely trapped. 500 high society guests stood in absolute silence watching the golden boy of the family empire being dragged away in chains. The illusion was finally over. 24 hours later, the intoxicating smell of imported orchids and expensive champagne had been completely replaced by the sharp, sterile stench of industrial bleach. I sat alone in a small, windowless interrogation room inside the federal holding facility in downtown Providence. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound breaking the heavy silence. I checked my watch. It was exactly 2 in the afternoon. At this exact moment yesterday, Derek was cutting a 10-tier wedding cake. Today, he was waiting for a bail hearing in a federal detention center. The heavy steel door clicked loudly and swung open. A federal guard escorted my brother into the room. Derek looked completely foreign. His custom-tailored tuxedo had been replaced by a standard-issue gray cotton jumpsuit. His perfect hair was disheveled and dark purple bags hung heavily under his bloodshot eyes. But despite spending his wedding night on a thin mattress in a concrete cell, the sheer arrogant entitlement radiating from him had not diminished one bit. He sat down heavily in the cold metal chair across from me, leaning forward as if we were in a corporate boardroom instead of a federal prison. He did not say thank you for coming. He did not apologize for the humiliating spectacle he had caused. He just glared at me with absolute expectation. "It is about time you showed up," Derek snapped aggressively, tapping his fingers on the cold metal table. "I have been telling these idiot guards since midnight that my sister runs a massive hedge fund. I need you to wire the bail money immediately. The judge set it at $2 million this morning. That is absolute pocket change for your firm. And I need you to retain the best white-collar defense attorney in New York. Do not get anyone local. I need a legal shark who can crush this absurd wire fraud charge before it permanently damages my corporate reputation." I sat perfectly still, resting my hands calmly in my lap. I watched him barking orders, as if I were his personal assistant. He was entirely disconnected from the catastrophic reality he had created. "Your reputation?" I asked, my voice echoing flatly off the painted cinder-block walls. "Derek, your reputation is completely destroyed. Simone filed for a legal annulment at 9 o'clock this morning. Her father handed the federal prosecutors a mountain of evidence against you. The bank seized the family real estate office at dawn, locking out all the employees. There is no reputation left to protect. You are a federal criminal facing a decade in prison." Derek waved his hand dismissively, scoffing at my words as if I were overreacting to a minor accounting error. "That is just temporary noise," he insisted, his eyes wild with desperate delusion. "Simone will calm down once I have a chance to explain the situation to her privately. The business can be restructured. I just need to get back to my office and move some assets around. But I cannot do any of that from inside this cage, Cassidy. I need you to cut the check right now." I stared at him, marveling at his absolute blindness. "Why on earth would you think I am going to pay your bail?" I asked softly. "Because I am still your blood," Derek demanded, slamming his palm against the metal table. "You made your point yesterday. You embarrassed Mom and Dad. You proved you are the smartest person in the room. Fine, you win. But the game is over now. You cannot just leave me in here with these criminals. I am your brother. We share the same last name. Family protects family, Cassidy. You have to get me out of here." I tilted my head, studying the desperate panic finally bleeding through his arrogant mask. "Did you forget what happened at your beautiful reception?" "Derek," I replied, my tone completely devoid of sympathy. "Our parents publicly handed me a notarized document removing my name from the family trust. You signed it yourself. You legally declared that I am not your family anymore. You completely severed our blood ties just so you could take 100% of the business and the debt. I do not share your last name, and I certainly do not owe you $2 million. Derek's face fell. The reality of the disownment letter finally crashed down on him. "But you have the money," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You are the only one who can save me." I reached into my designer purse and pulled out a single folded piece of paper. I did not pull out a checkbook or a legal retainer. I slowly slid the $80,000 catering bill from the rehearsal dinner across the scratched metal table. I paid for the lobster, I said, looking him dead in the eye. The lawyer is on you. I left Providence immediately after my visit with Derek. By Monday morning, I was back in my element. My corner penthouse office in Manhattan was a fortress of floor-to-ceiling glass and polished mahogany overlooking the entire city skyline. It was a world I had built with my own two hands, completely free from the toxic swamp of my family. I was sitting at my desk reviewing the final asset transfer documents for the Newport estate when the heavy oak doors of my suite violently flew open. My executive assistant stumbled backward, trying to block the doorway. "I am so sorry, Miss Cassidy," she stammered, looking terrified. They slipped past the lobby guards by claiming there was a life-or-death family emergency. I looked up from my paperwork. Standing in the doorway were Brenda and Richard. They looked absolutely unrecognizable. The Newport aristocrats were completely gone. Brenda was wearing the same wrinkled clothes from the wedding reception, and her expensive silver hair was a tangled mess. Richard looked like he had aged 10 years overnight. His posture was slumped, his tuxedo shirt was stained, and his face was pale with sheer terror. I waved my hand, signaling my assistant to step aside and close the door. As soon as the heavy door clicked shut, Brenda launched into her theatrical routine. She threw herself into one of the expensive leather guest chairs, sobbing uncontrollably. "You set us up," she wailed, pointing a shaking manicured finger at me. "You orchestrated this whole thing to destroy us." We drove back to Newport last night and there were federal marshals standing on the lawn. There are heavy chains and padlocks on our front gates, Cassidy. They posted seizure notices on the front door. We cannot even get inside to get our clothes or my jewelry. You knew this was going to happen, and you let us walk right into a trap. I slowly closed the file folder on my desk and leaned back in my chair. "I did not set you up, Brenda," I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "I just stopped being your human financial shield. You and Richard built this trap yourselves, brick by brick. Do you think I did not know what was going on all these years? I watched you co-sign his fraudulent loans when he was 25. I watched you empty my college savings account to cover up his first major embezzlement scandal. You treated me like a bank while you treated Derek like a god. You fed his delusions because you wanted the prestige of having a billionaire son without putting in the actual work. He is your brother." Richard rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "We were trying to protect him. We thought the bridge loan from the judge would fix everything. We did not know the federal government was already investigating the old debts." "Ignorance is not a legal defense," Richard Versailles shot back, standing up from my desk. "You were co-founders of the company. You signed the tax returns. When he bought that yacht 3 years ago, you knew the company was operating at a massive loss. You willfully turned a blind eye because he bought you expensive jewelry and luxury vacations with stolen money. And when the walls finally started closing in, your brilliant solution was to extort your own daughter. You tried to force me to sign over my equity so I would take the fall. You were perfectly willing to let me go to federal prison so your golden boy could keep playing pretend." Brenda cried harder, hiding her face in her hands. "We were desperate, Cassidy," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "We made a mistake. We are your parents. You cannot just leave us on the street. We have no money. Our accounts are completely frozen. We had to sleep in the rental car last night. You have the clothes on your back and you have each other," I said, walking over to the massive glass window. "That is far more than you ever gave me." Richard took a step forward, his pride completely shattered. He dropped to his knees on my expensive wool rug. It was a pathetic sight. A man who had spent his entire life bullying me was now groveling at my feet. "Please, Cassidy," Richard begged, clasping his hands together. "Forget about the house. Forget about the business. We just need a loan, a small loan. Derek is sitting in a federal holding cell. His public defender is a kid right out of law school. We need to hire a real defense attorney for him. Just lend us $200,000. You make that in a week, please. He will not survive in federal prison." I looked down at my father kneeling on the floor, begging for the son who had ruined them all. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I walked back to my desk and looked at the intercom panel. Without breaking eye contact with Richard, I reached out and firmly pressed the silver button on my desk. Within seconds, the heavy oak doors of my office swung open again. Two of my private security guards stepped into the room. They were massive men in tailored black suits, moving with silent professional efficiency. They took one look at Richard kneeling on the floor and moved forward to physically remove him. "Wait!" I commanded, raising my hand. The guards stopped instantly, crossing their arms and standing by the door like stone statues. I wanted my parents to leave, but I was not quite finished with them yet. I walked around my massive mahogany desk, my high heels sinking slightly into the expensive wool rug. I stood looking down at the two people who had spent my entire life making me feel completely worthless. Richard was still on his knees, looking up at me with pathetic, desperate eyes. Brenda was shrinking back into the leather guest chair, her face stained with ruined makeup. They thought this was the end of the line. They thought the worst thing I had done was blow the whistle on their golden boy. They still did not understand the true scale of what had actually happened over the weekend. I walked over to a small side table and picked up a thick black binder. I dropped it onto the glass coffee table right in front of my father. "What is this?" Richard asked, his voice trembling as he stared at the heavy binder. "Go ahead and open it," I offered, crossing my arms. He reached out with shaking hands and flipped open the heavy plastic cover. His bloodshot eyes scanned the first page, and his jaw dropped. Brenda leaned forward, peering over his shoulder. The documents inside were not federal indictments or police reports. They were corporate acquisition records. "You see, Richard?" I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady. "I did not just call the authorities to report Derek. That would have been too easy. I am a hedge fund manager. My debt-buying firm specializes in acquiring toxic corporate liabilities. 3 months ago, when the private lenders realized Derek was never going to pay them back, they auctioned off his $20 million debt for pennies on the dollar. I bought it all. My firm quietly acquired every single piece of paper tying your family to that failing enterprise." Richard stared at this paperwork, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. "I purchased the family business's defaulted loans." I continued, stepping closer to him so he could hear every single syllable clearly. "Every single contract, every single mortgage, and every single line of credit your golden boy signed. I did not just expose your fraud. I bought it. I am now your sole creditor. When the federal bank froze Derek's accounts on Saturday, they were acting on my legal authority. I own the commercial properties. I own your luxury cars. I even own the rights to Derek's offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. You do not owe the bank, Richard. You owe me." Brenda let out a choked gasp, clutching her chest as if she could not breathe. "But we are your parents," she whispered, her voice completely hollow. "You cannot take our home, Cassidy. We built that house. We raised you in that house. You cannot just throw your own mother and father out onto the street. It is completely inhumane." I shook my head, my expression completely cold. "You raised a scapegoat in that house, Brenda," I corrected her. "You raised a human punching bag to make yourselves feel powerful. You were perfectly willing to let me take the fall for federal wire fraud so your favorite child could keep living a lie. But you are not powerful anymore. The family real estate empire does not belong to Derek. It belongs to me. And as of this morning, I have officially begun the liquidation process. The Newport mansion is being seized to cover the interest payments you missed." Richard slumped backward, sitting on his heels, completely defeated. The aggressive, arrogant father who had threatened to destroy me just 48 hours ago was gone. He was nothing but a broken, bankrupt old man staring at the daughter he had thrown away. Brenda finally realized the absolute reality of their situation. The disownment letter they had so proudly handed me at the wedding was not just a shield. It was a sword I had used to sever myself from their sinking ship while simultaneously taking total control of their lives. Her legs gave out completely. She slid out of the leather guest chair and fell to her knees right on the floor next to her husband. She knelt, looking up at the daughter she had always treated like dirt, finally understanding that the scapegoat was now the undisputed master of their entire existence. 3 days after the wedding that never truly happened, my private office phone rang. My assistant informed me that a guest was waiting in the lobby and specifically requested a brief meeting. I checked my security cameras on the monitor. It was Simone. She was not wearing the stunning white silk gown anymore. Instead, she wore a sharp-tailored navy blazer and dark slacks, looking every bit the poised Atlanta heiress she was raised to be. I told my assistant to let her in, and I poured 2 cups of black coffee. When Simone walked into my corner penthouse office, she took a moment to look around. She took in the massive mahogany desk, the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, and the sleek professional atmosphere. She looked tired, but there was a quiet strength radiating from her. We had only ever spoken to each other across tense dinner tables surrounded by my toxic family. Now standing alone in my territory, the dynamic was completely different. "I appreciate you making time for me, Cassidy," Simone said, taking a seat in the leather chair opposite my desk. "I know you are busy dismantling what is left of Derek's empire." I handed her a cup of coffee and sat down. "It is not an empire, Simone," I corrected gently. "It was a house of cards. And you do not need to apologize for coming here. I imagine the last few days have been a nightmare for you." Simone took a slow sip of her coffee, holding the warm mug tightly in both hands. "My father finalized the annulment paperwork yesterday," she said, her voice steady but laced with lingering disbelief. "I spent the entire morning going through the financial disclosures Derek submitted when we first signed our prenuptial agreement. Every single page was a complete fabrication. He forged bank statements, tax returns, and property deeds. I feel incredibly stupid for believing him." "You are not stupid," I replied, leaning forward. "Derek is a professional con artist. He was raised by 2 people who spent 30 years teaching him how to manipulate the truth and hide his failures. He targeted you because you were smart, wealthy, and completely unaware of his history." Simone sighed heavily, resting her cup on the glass table. "That is what I wanted to talk to you about. My father and I hired a forensic accountant to trace the exact route of that $10 million bridge loan. I wanted to know exactly what Derek was planning to do with my family money." "I already know what he was planning," I said, crossing my arms. "He was going to route the $10 million through a Cayman Islands holding company to wash the trail. Then he was going to use those funds to pay down the most aggressive private lenders he owed. Once the heat was off, he would have convinced you to merge your personal trust fund with his corporate accounts to fund his next fake expansion. Within 5 years, your entire inheritance would have been drained to keep his sinking ship afloat." Simone stared at me, her dark eyes wide with terrible realization. "Our accountant said the exact same thing," she whispered. "He was going to use my family as his personal ATM until there was nothing left. If you had not spoken to my father before the ceremony, I would be legally tied to $20 million of federal debt right now. You saved my life, Cassidy." "I did not do it to be a hero, Simone," I admitted honestly. "I did it because my parents tried to throw me under the bus to save him. But I am glad you got out before the trap snapped shut. You deserve much better than my brother." Simone smiled a genuine warm smile that reached her eyes. She reached into her leather briefcase and pulled out a sleek silver folder. She slid it across my desk right next to my coffee cup. "My father is a very powerful man in Atlanta," Cassidy, Simone said, her tone shifting from a victim to a sharp businesswoman. "He sits on the board of directors for 3 major private equity groups. He told his colleagues exactly what happened over the weekend. He told them how you single-handedly exposed a massive federal wire fraud scheme and legally acquired the defaulted assets without breaking a single compliance law." I looked at the silver folder and then back at Simone. "And what exactly did his colleagues say about that?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. "They said you are exactly the kind of ruthless, intelligent financial manager they want handling their money," Simone replied, leaning back in her chair. "That folder contains the preliminary paperwork for an exclusive partnership. The Carter family and our associated investment groups want your hedge fund to manage our primary portfolios. It is an initial transfer of $100 million in capital." I stared at the folder, the magnitude of the offer sinking in. My family had tried to destroy me to steal $10 million. Now, the very people they tried to defraud were handing me 10 times that amount, simply because I had the integrity to burn the liars to the ground. The liquidation process was swift and entirely merciless. I did not rely on standard debt collection agencies. I deployed my firm's elite team of corporate auditors and asset recovery specialists directly to Newport. 2 days after my parents barged into my Manhattan office, I stood on the manicured lawn of the sprawling estate I used to call home. A fleet of heavy white moving trucks was parked along the circular driveway. The massive iron gates, which usually kept the world out, were locked wide open. Men in heavy boots were systematically emptying the house, carrying out expensive leather sofas, antique tables, and crystal chandeliers. I stood near the front portico holding a digital tablet that listed every single item of value owned by the family firm. My lead auditor, a sharp man named Evans, walked out of the front door holding a small velvet box. He looked frustrated. "Ms. Cassidy," Evans said, handing me the box. "We have a problem with the inventory list." I opened the box. It was empty. "This is supposed to hold the sapphire necklace my mother bought last year." I noted, tapping the screen on my tablet. "Where is it?" "That is exactly the issue," Evans replied, shaking his head. "Several high-value portable items are missing from the master bedroom. The sapphire necklace, 3 Rolex watches, and a collection of rare silver coins. We scoured the safe, but it was completely empty." I looked up toward the second-floor windows. My parents were still inside the house. I had allowed them a few hours to pack 2 suitcases of personal clothing before the marshals officially locked the doors. They were supposed to be gathering basics, not raiding the corporate collateral. I handed the empty box back to Evans and walked briskly through the grand foyer. The house looked entirely different, stripped of its expensive furniture. The echo of my heels against the bare hardwood floors sounded hollow. I climbed the grand staircase and walked straight toward the master suite. I did not knock. I pushed the heavy wooden door open. Richard was kneeling on the floor, frantically stuffing something into a worn leather duffel bag. Brenda was standing near the closet, nervously twisting her hands. When the door swung open, Richard jumped up, trying to kick the duffel bag under the bed. He looked like a cornered rat. "What are you doing, Richard?" I asked, stepping into the room. "Just packing my socks." Richard stammered, a nervous sweat breaking out across his forehead. "You said we could take 2 bags. I am just getting my socks." I walked over to the bed and pulled the heavy leather bag out from underneath the frame. I unzipped it. It was not full of socks. It was packed tight with the missing Rolex watches, the sapphire necklace, the silver coins, and several stacks of $100 bills banded together. I let out a slow, disappointed breath. "You are really not very good at this, Richard," I said, looking up at him. "When a federal bankruptcy proceeding has been initiated, attempting to conceal physical assets is a felony. It is called fraudulent transfer. You are already facing conspiracy charges regarding Derek's wire fraud. Do you really want to add asset concealment to your federal indictment?" Brenda burst into fresh tears, rushing forward to grab my arm. "Please, Cassidy," she cried. "We just need something to sell. We have absolutely no money to survive. You cannot leave us with nothing." I pulled my arm away from her grasp. I picked up the leather bag and handed it directly to one of my auditors, who had followed me up the stairs. "Log everything in this bag," I instructed clearly, "and notify the federal marshals that Richard attempted to conceal collateral. They can add it to his file." Richard slumped against the wall, completely defeated. He did not even try to argue. I walked out of the master bedroom, leaving them to face the consequences of their greed. I wandered down the hallway toward the back of the house. I stopped in front of the door to my old childhood bedroom. It was the small, pale blue room Brenda had forced me to sleep in. The movers had already cleared out the bed and the dresser. The room was completely bare except for a small pile of trash swept into the center of the floor. I walked over to the pile. Sticking out from under a discarded cardboard box was a small notebook with a faded green cover. I picked it up. It was my old childhood diary. I had hidden it under a loose floorboard when I was 14 years old. Brenda must have found it while searching the house for valuables and simply tossed it in the trash when she realized it was worthless. I flipped through the pages, reading the desperate entries of a little girl begging for her parents' love. The words were full of pain and confusion. I stared at the faded ink, realizing how long I had carried that heavy burden. I walked out of the room and carried the diary down to the main living room. The massive stone fireplace was completely empty. I dropped the diary onto the cold stone hearth. I struck a match and dropped it onto the faded green cover. I stood there and watched the pages curl and burn, turning my painful history into nothing but gray ash. The scapegoat was finally dead. I walked out of the empty Newport mansion, leaving the ashes of my past in the cold stone fireplace. The drive back to Manhattan felt like crossing a finish line. Over the next week, my firm aggressively processed the seized assets. The commercial properties were quickly auctioned off to developers who were eager to tear down my brother's failing projects. The luxury vehicles, including the custom sports cars Derek paraded around in, were liquidated to cover the outstanding legal fees. I was sitting at my desk on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, reviewing the final foreclosure documents when my private line rang. The caller ID displayed an unknown Washington, D.C. area code. I picked up the receiver, keeping my eyes on my computer screen. "This is Cassidy," I answered, my voice crisp and professional. "Ms. Cassidy, my name is David. I am the federal public defender assigned to represent your brother Derek." I leaned back in my leather chair, picking up a heavy silver pen. "I am surprised you have the time to make personal phone calls, David," I replied. "I imagine defending a man caught red-handed committing federal wire fraud is a rather time-consuming endeavor, especially considering the amount of evidence the prosecution possesses." David let out a heavy, exhausted sigh. The audio quality was slightly muffled, as if he were calling from a crowded courthouse hallway. "It is an incredibly difficult case, Ms. Cassidy," he admitted, sounding genuinely defeated. "The federal prosecutors have an airtight timeline of the fraudulent transfers." Judge Carter handed them the banking logs on a silver platter. "Derek is currently facing a mandatory minimum of 8 years in a federal penitentiary. He is in solitary confinement for his own protection, and his mental state is deteriorating rapidly." "I fail to see how his sentencing guidelines or his mental state are my concern, David," I said calmly, resting my elbows on the mahogany desk. "I am not his legal guardian. In fact, legally speaking, I am not even his sister anymore." "I know about the disownment letter," David replied quickly, "but I am calling because you are the primary creditor holding the defaulted corporate loans. Ms. Cassidy, the civil suits your firm filed are compounding his criminal liability. The prosecutors are using your civil filings to establish the maximum financial damage. If you maintain the asset forfeiture, claims the judge will view his crimes at their absolute highest severity. But if you drop the civil suits and agree to a private restructuring plan, we can show the court that the victims are willing to cooperate. It could shave 3 or 4 years off his sentence. I am begging you to show him some leniency." He is completely terrified. I stopped twirling the silver pen and placed it flat on my desk. "You want me to drop a $20 million civil suit so your client can get a lighter sentence?" I asked, my tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You want my firm to absorb his massive debt, just so he can spend a little less time wearing a gray jumpsuit?" "He is a broken man, Ms. Cassidy," David pleaded. "He made a terrible mistake, but a decade in a federal prison will completely destroy whatever is left of his life. He has 0 assets left. Your firm already took the Newport house and the entire real estate business. You have won the war. Please, you have the power to show a little humanity here. Give him a chance to rebuild someday." I stood up from my desk and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the rain batter the glass of my corner office. Humanity. I echoed, a cold, sharp laugh escaping my lips. "Let me tell you a story about my brother's humanity, David. When I was 22 years old, I was working 3 separate jobs just to pay the interest on the student loans my parents forced me to take out. Those loans were used to buy Derek a brand new sports car to celebrate his college graduation. One night, I was so exhausted from working a double shift that I collapsed on the kitchen floor. Derek stepped right over me on his way out to a luxury club. David remained completely silent on the other end of the line. I asked him for help that night. I continued, my voice hard and unforgiving. I begged him to sell the sports car, so I could pay my tuition and actually afford to graduate. Do you know what my brother told me, David? He looked down at me with a smirk and said, "The market does not care about your feelings, Cassidy. If you cannot afford to play the game, you deserve to lose." I took a deep breath, letting the painful memory wash away. "So you can tell my brother that I am just following his brilliant financial advice," I said, gripping the phone tightly. "I am not dropping the civil suits. I am going to pursue every single penny until he is legally bankrupt for the rest of his natural life. If he cannot afford to play the game, he deserves to lose." There was a long, heavy pause on the line. I could hear the faint sound of police sirens wailing in the background of David's call. "I understand," David finally said, his voice completely devoid of hope. I had to ask. "It is my job to explore every possible avenue for my client. But since you are officially refusing the plea deal mitigation, I have to inform you about our alternate strategy." I frowned, turning away from the rain-slicked window. "What alternate strategy?" "Derek is desperate, Ms. Cassidy," David explained, his voice dropping to a low, confidential whisper. "If he cannot get leniency through a civil settlement, he has to get it by cooperating with the federal prosecutors. He is officially turning state evidence tomorrow morning." "Turning evidence against who?" I asked, my eyes narrowing. "Against the original co-founders of the corporation," David replied grimly. "He signed a proffer agreement to testify that the entire wire fraud scheme was not his idea. He is going to swear under oath that Brenda and Richard masterminded the entire operation. He is throwing your parents under the bus to save himself." I let David's words hang in the heavy air of my office. He was throwing my parents under the bus. The golden child, the boy who could do no wrong, was preparing to sit in a federal courtroom and swear under oath that Brenda and Richard were the true masterminds behind the wire fraud. It was a spectacular level of betrayal. A thief turning on the very people who had spent 3 decades teaching him how to steal. I thanked David for his time and placed the receiver gently back onto the base of the phone. A cold, satisfying smile crept across my face. The snake was finally eating its own tail. It did not take long for the legal fallout to reach the cheap rental apartment my parents had been forced to move into. Exactly 2 days after my conversation with the public defender, my personal cell phone began vibrating on my glass coffee table. I was sitting on my velvet sofa reading a quarterly earnings report. The caller ID displayed Brenda's number. I had ignored her previous calls since the eviction, but this one I had to answer. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. I did not even get a chance to say a polite hello. "Cassidy," Brenda screamed into the phone. Her voice was unrecognizable, entirely stripped of its usual arrogant polish. It was a raw, guttural sound of pure panic. "They served us. Federal marshals just knocked on our door and handed us subpoenas. We have to appear before a grand jury on Friday morning. They are going to indict us." I took a slow sip of my coffee, looking out over the Manhattan skyline. "I am aware, Brenda," I replied smoothly, not bothering to hide the calm satisfaction in my voice. "The federal prosecutors are building a massive corporate racketeering case. When the primary suspect signs a proffer agreement, the CO conspirators are always the next dominoes to fall. He lied to them." Brenda sobbed hysterically, her breath hitching wildly. "We read the summary of his statement attached to the summons. Derek told the federal prosecutors that your father and I forced him to secure those fraudulent loans. He told them we manipulated the corporate ledgers and threatened to cut him out of the business if he did not wire the money to the Cayman Islands. He is framing us, Cassidy, his own parents. He is trying to send us to federal prison so he can get a reduced sentence." She broke down into loud, ugly tears, coughing and gasping for air. "How could he do this to us?" she wailed, her voice cracking under the weight of the ultimate betrayal. "We gave him everything. We sacrificed our entire lives to make sure he was successful. We protected him from every single consequence. And he just stabbed us in the back without a second thought. He is a sociopath. He is a monster." I listened to her weep, feeling absolutely no sympathy for the woman who had spent my entire childhood treating me like an unwanted burden. "You built the monster, Brenda," I said, my voice dropping to a freezing, merciless whisper. "You fed his ego. You covered up his mistakes. You taught him that the rules did not apply to him as long as he had the right last name. You created a man who values absolutely nothing but himself, and now you get to live with him. Or rather, you get to share a cell block with him. The line went dead quiet for a long moment, save for the sound of Brenda's ragged breathing. When she finally spoke again, the desperate sobbing was completely gone. In its place was the cold, vindictive venom I had known my entire life. She was backed into a legal corner, and she was ready to lash out at the only target she had left. "You think this is funny?" Brenda hissed, her voice vibrating with pure, unadulterated malice. "You think you can just sit in your glass tower and watch us burn to the ground? You engineered this entire tragedy, Cassidy. You bought the debt. You humiliated us at the wedding. You backed Derek into a corner until he had absolutely no choice but to turn on us to survive." I did not force Derek to commit federal wire fraud. I reminded her sharply, my patience wearing thin. I just stopped paying for the cleanup. "Nobody cares about the truth!" Brenda spat, her voice rising into a frantic shriek. "They care about a good story, and I'm going to give them one. If you do not call your lawyers right now and drop the civil suits against our estate, I am calling the press. I have the private number for the lead investigative reporter at the Wall Street Journal. I am going to tell them exactly how the ruthless hedge fund manager orchestrated the complete destruction of her own family out of pure spite and childhood jealousy. I will tell the world that you planted the financial evidence to steal the family company. I will destroy your corporate reputation, Cassidy. I will drag you right down into the mud with us." I let Brenda scream her threats until she finally ran out of breath. "You are going to regret this, Cassidy," she gasped, her voice hoarse and ragged. "I am calling the Journal right now. I will make sure everyone in the financial sector knows exactly what kind of monster you really are." I did not raise my voice or argue with her. I simply smiled, a cold, sharp smile. "Go ahead, Brenda," I told her calmly. "Call the papers. Tell them whatever story you want. I guarantee you they will be much more interested in the story I am about to tell them." I ended the call and tossed my phone onto the glass table. Brenda thought she held the ultimate leverage by threatening public humiliation. She still operated under the delusion that I cared about the polished facade of high society Newport. But I operated in the cutthroat world of Manhattan corporate finance, where perception was reality, and he who controlled the narrative controlled the market. I picked up my desk phone and pressed the button for my public relations director. "Book the main press room on the ground floor," I instructed as soon as he answered. "Invite every major financial reporter in the city. Tell them my firm is holding an emergency press conference regarding a major acquisition and the successful dismantling of a $20 million corporate wire fraud ring. Have it ready in 2 hours." 2 hours later, I stood at a sleek glass podium facing a packed room of journalists, flashing cameras, and rolling television crews. I wore a sharp, black-tailored suit, my posture perfectly straight, projecting absolute authority. I looked out over the sea of reporters, feeling completely in my element. This was my world, not Brenda's. "Good afternoon," I began, my voice projecting clearly through the microphone. "I called this press conference today to announce a significant victory for our firm and a major win for corporate transparency. Over the past 3 months, my team has been quietly acquiring a massive portfolio of defaulted commercial debt previously held by several private lenders. Today, I can confirm that those loans were tied to a sophisticated Ponzi scheme operating under the guise of a prominent real estate firm." The reporters began scribbling furiously on their notepads. "We successfully acquired the debt, forced the defaulting company into liquidation, and coordinated with federal authorities to ensure the immediate arrest of the primary operator." I continued, maintaining a steady professional cadence. "Our firm takes corporate fraud incredibly seriously. We do not just buy debt, we clean up toxic liabilities and hold the operators accountable to the fullest extent of the law." A tall reporter from the Financial Times raised his hand, practically jumping out of his seat. "Ms. Cassidy," he called out, his voice cutting through the hum of the crowd, "our sources indicate that the primary operator arrested over the weekend was Derek, and the real estate firm in question is owned by Richard and Brenda. Are you confirming that your firm aggressively targeted and liquidated a company owned by your own parents and brother?" The room went completely silent. This was the trap Brenda was banking on. She wanted the press to paint me as a vindictive daughter, destroying her own flesh and blood out of petty jealousy. The camera zoomed in on my face, waiting for a moment of hesitation or defensive panic. I did not hesitate. I reached into the breast pocket of my blazer and pulled out the thick folded parchment paper. I unfolded it carefully, placing it flat on the glass podium right next to the microphone. I can confirm that the individuals you named were arrested for federal wire fraud, I answered, my voice ringing with absolute conviction. However, I must correct your assumption regarding my relationship to those individuals. I am not legally related to them. I picked up the parchment paper, holding it up so the cameras could clearly capture the dark blue ink and the embossed notary stamp. This is a formal notarized letter of disownment, I explained, projecting my voice across the silent room. It was legally executed and publicly presented to me by Richard, Brenda, and Derek prior to their arrest. They formally severed all legal ties, removed my name from their trusts, and explicitly declared that I am not a member of their family. The reporters stared in absolute shock. The camera shutters began clicking frantically, a rapid-fire symphony of breaking news. I did not target my family. I continued, placing the document back onto the podium. I targeted a corrupt organization that was defrauding private investors and attempting to steal $10 million from an innocent family in Atlanta. The fact that the perpetrators used to share my last name did not grant them immunity from the law or from the consequences of their financial crimes. My firm operates with absolute integrity. We do not protect criminals, we liquidate them. The press room erupted into chaos. Reporters shouted questions over each other, trying to get more details about the disownment letter and the offshore wire transfers. I answered a few more technical questions, maintaining my cold professional composure before stepping away from the podium and letting my PR director handle the frenzy. By the time I took the private elevator back up to my penthouse office, the news was already breaking on every major financial network. The narrative was completely sealed. Brenda could call whoever she wanted, but nobody was going to listen to a desperate, indicted co-conspirator trying to smear the ruthless executive who took them down. I walked over to my desk and looked at the live market ticker on my computer monitor. Investors loved a CEO who valued profit and the law over toxic personal ties. Within 20 minutes of the press conference ending, the stock value of my hedge fund skyrocketed up 12%. 6 months after the press conference that cemented my corporate legacy, I found myself sitting in the gallery of a federal courthouse. The transition from Manhattan finance to the justice system was jarring but necessary. I sat in the second row wearing a sharp charcoal suit. To my right sat Simone, looking immaculate. Beside her sat Judge Carter, projecting silent, imposing authority. We did not speak. The gravity of the room demanded absolute silence. Down at the defense tables, the remnants of my former family sat huddled with their respective legal teams. The contrast was striking. Derek wore an oversized orange jumpsuit, his wrists shackled to a heavy chain around his waist. He had lost a significant amount of weight and his hair was thinning rapidly. The golden boy of Newport looked like a hollowed-out shell of a human being. A few feet away at a separate table sat Brenda and Richard. They wore cheap off-the-rack suits completely devoid of their former high society glamour. Because Derek had turned state evidence against them, they were legally required to maintain separate counsel. They had not spoken to their son in 6 months. The federal judge, a stern woman with steel gray hair, entered the courtroom and took her seat high above us all. She adjusted her reading glasses and picked up the thick sentencing report. The room collectively held its breath as she began to read the final judgments. She addressed Richard first. Because he was a secondary player, and because his financial ruin at my hands had already stripped him of all assets, the judge showed a small fraction of leniency. Richard was sentenced to 5 years of federal probation and ordered to perform 2,000 hours of community service. He slumped forward in his chair, burying his face in his hands, weeping quietly. He was a broken man who would spend the rest of his life picking up trash. Then the judge turned her attention to Derek. The silence in the gallery deepened. She recounted the sheer magnitude of his financial crimes. She noted the $20 million in defaulted loans and the brazen attempt to defraud a retired federal judge and his daughter. She specifically highlighted how Derek had callously attempted to use his own family members as financial meat shields. Derek, you operated with a level of arrogance and deception that is truly staggering, the federal judge stated, her voice echoing off the polished oak walls. You exploited every single person who ever trusted you. You believed that your background and your connections elevated you above the law. Today, you will learn that they do not. For the charges of federal wire fraud and conspiracy, I sentence you to 8 years in a federal penitentiary with no possibility of early parole. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down with a loud crack that seemed to shake the floorboards. Suddenly, a piercing shriek shattered the solemn atmosphere of the courtroom. It was Brenda. She shot up from her chair, knocking it backward onto the floor. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged hysteria. "No!" she screamed, her voice cracking as she pointed a shaking finger at the judge. "You cannot do this. He is a good boy. He made a mistake. It is her fault. She made him do it." Brenda turned and pointed wildly at me, sitting calmly in the gallery. "She ruined us," Brenda wailed, thrashing against the defense attorney who was desperately trying to pull her back down. "She stole our money. She framed him. You are sending an innocent boy to prison while the real criminal is sitting right there." The judge slammed her gavel again, demanding order. 2 heavy-set bailiffs rushed forward, grabbing Brenda by the arms. She kicked and screamed, completely losing her mind in front of a gallery full of federal agents and reporters. Richard did not even look up to help her. He just kept his face buried in his hands, completely defeated by the chaotic destruction of his own family. As Brenda was dragged out of the courtroom, still screaming my name, another pair of bailiffs hauled Derek up from his chair. They turned him around to lead him toward the holding cells. As he shuffled down the center aisle, the heavy chains clinking against his ankles, he stopped. He turned his head and locked eyes with me. His gaze was full of desperate terror and a silent, agonizing plea for recognition. He wanted me to smile. He wanted me to gloat. I sat perfectly still. I did not smile. I did not frown. I looked right through him as if he were a complete stranger, as if he did not exist. I walked out of the federal courthouse, leaving the chaotic echoes of my former family trapped behind its heavy mahogany doors. The crisp afternoon air felt remarkably clean. My private driver, Thomas, was waiting by the curb, standing at attention next to my sleek black town car. He opened the rear door for me, and I slid into the quiet leather interior. Instead of directing him back to the private airstrip for my flight to Manhattan, I handed him a slip of paper with a specific address. Thomas glanced at the paper, his professional expression faltering for just a fraction of a second. It was an address located on the absolute outer edges of Providence, far away from the manicured lawns and ocean views of Newport. He nodded silently, putting the car into gear and merging into the heavy city traffic. We drove for 45 minutes, watching the landscape slowly deteriorate. The towering glass skyscrapers and high-end boutiques gradually faded, giving way to rusted chain-link fences, boarded-up storefronts, and crumbling asphalt. We finally pulled into the parking lot of a dilapidated apartment complex that bordered a rundown trailer park. The buildings were painted a peeling, faded yellow, and the gutters sagged under the weight of rotting leaves. I instructed Thomas to park across the street under the shadow of a large dying oak tree. I kept the tinted windows rolled up, leaving the engine idling quietly. We sat in silence for 10 minutes before a battered, rust-covered sedan sputtered into the complex parking lot. The passenger door creaked open and Brenda stepped out. I almost did not recognize her. The woman who used to spend thousands of dollars a week on spa treatments and designer gowns was wearing faded sweatpants and a stained, oversized t-shirt. Her silver hair was tied back in a messy, uneven knot. She walked around to the trunk and struggled to lift several flimsy plastic grocery bags bursting with generic canned goods. A moment later, Richard appeared from the driver's side. He was wearing a bright orange reflective vest over a cheap flannel shirt, holding a metal trash picker tool. He had just returned from his court-mandated community service. He did not even offer to help his wife with the heavy bags. He just slammed his door and trudged toward their ground-floor apartment, his head hung low in absolute defeat. Thomas watched the pathetic scene unfold through the windshield. He had been my driver for 5 years and knew enough about my background to understand exactly who we were looking at. He glanced at me through the rearview mirror, his eyes reflecting a quiet mixture of shock and pity. "Do you want me to pull closer, Ms. Cassidy?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Perhaps you want to roll down the window and say something to them." I leaned back against the plush leather seat, crossing my legs comfortably. "No, Thomas," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I just wanted to see if the aesthetic suited them." Thomas furrowed his brow, slightly confused by the word. "The aesthetic," he echoed politely. "Yes," I continued, my gaze locked on Brenda as she fumbled with her keys, dropping a plastic bag onto the cracked concrete. When I was 16 years old, my mother hosted a massive dinner party for the local real estate board. She hired a private chef and decorated the dining room with imported silk flowers. I had just come home from a double shift at my after-school job. I was exhausted and wearing a cheap uniform that smelled like grease. I tried to sit down at the very end of the grand dining table just to eat a small plate of leftover food. Brenda marched over, grabbed me by the arm, and physically dragged me into the catering kitchen. She told me I was entirely too ugly and poor to be seen by her wealthy guests. She said my presence ruined the aesthetic of her perfect family. She forced me to eat my cold dinner standing up next to the industrial garbage cans, while Derek sat at the head of the table laughing with the millionaires. Thomas gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white as he listened to the story. I watched Brenda bend down to pick up the cans of cheap soup that had rolled across the dirty pavement. Her knees popped visibly, and she let out a heavy, exhausted sigh that I could practically feel from across the street. She looked incredibly old. She looked frail and entirely broken. A part of me expected to feel a sudden rush of vindictive joy. Another part of me wondered if I would feel a sudden pang of guilt seeing the people who gave me life reduced to absolute poverty. But as I sat in the climate-controlled luxury of my town car watching them struggle, I realized the most profound truth of all. I felt absolutely nothing. The anger that had fueled my ambition for 33 years was completely gone. The desperate need for their validation had evaporated. They were just two strangers fighting to survive in a mess of their own creation. Brenda finally gathered her spilled groceries. As she stood up, she paused, wiping sweat from her forehead. She looked across the street directly at my idling town car. She could not see through the heavy black tint of the windows, but she stared at the expensive vehicle with a look of bitter resentment. She hated whoever was sitting inside simply because they had the wealth she had lost. I did not roll the window down to gloat. I did not step out to offer them a handful of cash. I owed them absolutely nothing. "Take us to the airport, Thomas," I said, pressing the button to ensure my window was tightly sealed against the outside world. "I have a business empire to run." Thomas nodded sharply, putting the car into drive. The tires pulled smoothly away from the curb, leaving the rusted trailer park far behind in the rearview mirror. The cord was completely cut. The flight back to New York was smooth and entirely uneventful. By the time I stepped out of the private elevator and into my penthouse office, the sun was beginning to set over the Manhattan skyline. The sky was painted in brilliant strokes of orange and gold, casting a warm glow across the polished mahogany and glass of my sanctuary. It was a stark, beautiful contrast to the decaying yellow walls of the trailer park I had left behind in Rhode Island. I took off my tailored suit jacket and draped it over the back of my leather chair. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water and stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city that never slept. I had conquered my past, and now it was time to officially claim the spoils of that long, hard-fought victory. My lead paralegal walked into the office carrying a thick stack of legal folders bound with heavy rubber bands. He placed them carefully on the center of my desk. "These are the final asset absorption contracts, Ms. Cassidy," he announced, his voice full of professional respect. "Everything has been cleared by the Federal Bankruptcy Court and the Asset Forfeiture Division. Once you sign these pages, the Newport estate, the commercial properties, and all remaining liquidated capital will be permanently transferred into the primary portfolio of your hedge fund. The transition is completely ironclad. There will be no room for appeals or contesting the transfer." I sat down at my desk and picked up my heavy silver pen. I opened the first folder. It contained the deed to the sprawling Newport mansion, where I had spent my childhood feeling like an unwanted ghost. I flipped to the signature page and signed my name with smooth, deliberate strokes. I opened the next folder. It contained the commercial real estate deeds, the very foundation of the empire my parents had tried to use to protect their golden child. I signed my name again. Page after page, folder after folder, I methodically erased their legacy and legally absorbed it into my own. The assets they had hoarded to elevate Derek were now just numbers on my corporate balance sheet, completely stripped of their toxic history. As the ink dried on the final document, a profound silence settled over the room. For 33 years, a deep burning anger had lived inside my chest. It was the anger of a little girl who was constantly pushed aside for a brother who could do no wrong. It was the rage of a teenager who was forced to pay for the mistakes of her own abusers. That anger had fueled my late nights studying finance. It had driven my ambition and sharpened my corporate instincts. I had used it as a weapon to build my own empire from the ground up, because I knew that one day they would come for me and I needed to be completely bulletproof. But as I closed the last folder, I realized the fire was gone. The anger that had defined my entire existence had completely burned out. In its place was something much colder and infinitely more satisfying. It was the undeniable reality of absolute independence. I did not need their validation anymore. I did not need to prove that I was smarter or more successful than Derek. The legal documents sitting on my desk already proved it. I had completely dismantled the toxic hierarchy that had suffocated me, and I had done it without breaking a single law. I was finally free from their shadow. I did not owe them a single explanation or a single cent. My paralegal gathered the signed folders and quietly excused himself, leaving me alone in the dimming light of the office. I took a deep breath, savoring the quiet peace of the empty room. Then my personal cell phone buzzed gently on the glass coffee table. I walked over and picked it up, expecting an email from a client or a market update from my brokers. Instead, the screen displayed a text message from Simone. We had stayed in touch over the last 6 months, occasionally exchanging brief updates about the legal proceedings. But this message was completely different. I opened the text. It read, "My father and I are hosting a large Thanksgiving dinner at our estate in Atlanta next month. We know the holidays can be complicated, but we would be absolutely honored if you would join us. You protected our family, Cassidy. We would love for you to come and celebrate with ours." I stared at the glowing screen, reading the words over and over again. It was not a demand for money. It was not a guilt trip or a manipulation tactic. It was just a genuine, warm invitation from people who actually respected me. I typed a simple reply to Simone, thanking her and gladly accepting the invitation. I set the phone face down on my desk, feeling a strange new warmth settling in my chest. For the first time in my life, I was actually looking forward to the holiday season. I walked over to the private wet bar tucked into the corner of my office. I poured a generous measure of expensive aged bourbon into a heavy crystal glass, enjoying the rich amber color as it caught the ambient light of the room. I walked across the plush carpet and pushed open the heavy sliding glass doors, stepping out onto the expansive private balcony of my penthouse. The cold evening air of Manhattan hit my face immediately, but the bourbon warmed my chest from the inside out. I leaned against the thick glass railing, looking down at the endless glowing grid of streetlights and moving cars. This was the city I had conquered. Down there, millions of people were rushing home to their families. Some were returning to loving, supportive homes, while others were unknowingly walking back into toxic emotional battlegrounds. For 33 years, I had been a prisoner of a family that only valued me for what they could extract from me. They had demanded my money, my time, and ultimately my freedom. But tonight, standing hundreds of feet above the concrete pavement, I was completely untouchable. I took a slow sip of the bourbon, letting the smooth burn ground me in reality. I thought about Derek. Right now, my arrogant golden child of a brother was sitting in a tiny concrete cell in a high-security federal penitentiary. He had traded his custom-tailored tuxedos and luxury sports cars for a scratchy orange jumpsuit and heavy steel chains. He would spend the next 8 years waking up to the sound of metal doors slamming shut, completely stripped of his fake billionaire persona. There would be no fancy restaurants, no high society parties, and no wealthy in-laws to bail him out. He had built his entire identity on lies and stolen money. Now he was nothing but an inmate number in a system that did not care about his last name. His grand illusion had been shattered into a million unfixable pieces. Then my thoughts drifted to Brenda and Richard. They had spent their entire lives obsessed with appearances, desperate to maintain their status among the Newport elite. Now they were living in a damp, peeling apartment next to a rusted trailer park. They had no money, no assets, and no friends. The wealthy socialites they had tried so hard to impress had completely blacklisted them the moment the federal indictments were unsealed. They were forced to wear cheap clothes, buy generic groceries, and work exhausting manual labor jobs just to survive. They had sacrificed their only daughter to protect their son, and in the end, the son they worshipped had thrown them under the bus without a second thought to save his own skin. The poetic justice of their situation was absolute. They had handed me a notarized letter of disownment thinking it was the ultimate punishment. They thought they were throwing me out into the cold. Instead, they had handed me the exact legal weapon I needed to sever my liabilities, take total control of their corporate empire, and leave them completely destitute. They had engineered their own flawless destruction. I took another sip of bourbon, feeling a profound sense of satisfaction wash over me. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was no longer the quiet daughter taking the blame for a corrupt family. I was the CEO of a massive corporate debt acquisition firm. I was a titan of industry managing hundreds of millions of dollars in capital. I had taken the very company my parents used to belittle me, and I had absorbed it into my own massive portfolio. The legacy they had tried to steal from me was now firmly and legally mine. I had completely rewritten the narrative of my own life. I looked up at the dark sky, watching the lights of an airplane blink high above the city skyline. I had finally found my peace not through forgiveness, but through ruthless, undeniable accountability. I had protected myself, and in the process, I had forged a new family out of mutual respect and absolute integrity. I finished my bourbon and set the crystal glass down on the small outdoor table, ready to face whatever tomorrow would bring. Family isn't an excuse to be used as collateral. If they hand you a sword to fall on, take it and use it to cut the ties. Have you ever been the family scapegoat? How did you take your power back? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of sweet, undeniable justice.